Welcome back all, Dr. JC here, Lecture 3, Part 3. We're going to build on the previous two parts, Renaissance in Part 1, the Reformation in Part 2, and take a look at the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment periods here. Very transformative periods, very impactful periods. So let's jump right into what this whole meaning of this Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment really was. While the Renaissance did lead to this rebirth of Europe, this reinvestigation of science and nature as a way to glorify and understand God or nature's God's world, it didn't end conflict. Europeans will continuously be at odds with one another. A great example of that is the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. In the Near East, those great Muslim gunpowder empires don't necessarily get along. And in the Far East, you're going to see a change in dynasties. The Ming are going to be in the decline, the Qing and the ascendancy. And as a result of that, there's going to be conflict with neighbors, such as the great Choson dynasty in Korea, and Japan trying to figure itself out as well. Do we continue with this Tokugawa samurai period, or do we become more industrialized and enter into this new Meiji dynasty? So much conflict abroad in the 1600s and 1700s, to be sure. But all the fighting wasn't going to stop people from asking questions why, stop them from investigating, stop them from trying to understand their world about them, whether it's on their own human behavior or things of God or nature's God. And therefore, the scientific revolution and enlightenment, which we'll talk about, to include specific individuals, which we'll highlight here, were immensely important because they posit notions of what we would consider to be part of a modern world, a modern mind, a modern society. And with that in mind, let's turn to the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution is going to begin in the latter part of the Renaissance and serve as a great bridge or launching pad of sorts into the Enlightenment, which will come behind it. Now, clearly, as the name implies, this is going to be much more scientific in its focus and its approach. The Enlightenment, however, will be much more ideological. So in some ways, we could think of the scientific revolution as more left brain, and the Enlightenment that comes behind it more right brain. But if you take these two periods together, you get the more modern brain, or right and left brain, at least as it relates to thought and theory. Starting with the more analytical or left brain, we'll introduce a few of these individuals here, many of which you know by name and perhaps have studied at some length. Folks such as those depicted here that would call into question existing truth claims of the day. One example of a truth claim of the day was that the earth was at the center of all things. Everyone knew it. It was just the freaking truth. Until it wasn't the truth. Galileo would say, not so fast, my friends, through direct observation, through the application of this thing called a scientific method, where we apply, put down a hypothesis, we test the genius or folly of it, and it goes on and on and on. Said, heck no. The Earth is not at the center here, the sun is. Now clearly there's going to be some institutions, hint hint, the Catholic Church, that didn't necessarily like this message. After all, if you proclaim that the Pope is divinely appointed by a supreme being, why in the world would the supreme being put the person that's supposed to be in charge of all of things 3 rocks away from the center of something? Wouldn't that individual just be at the center rather than 3 rocks away from the center? So while it may not have been the intention of individuals to call into question the existing social order of the day, by direct observation, they did. And from this foundational scientific work, there were individuals that started to bleed that mindset into philosophy and realms we might consider the arts. One such example, René Descartes. I'm less concerned about the old philosophical statement that is associated with him, I think, therefore I am. Whatever the hell that means, all right? Dude, seriously? Come on. What does that mean, by the way? You guys figure it out. But what Descartes will do, joking aside, is he will begin to lay down the foundations for this ism known as rationalism, whereby the use of numbers, zeros and ones, we can establish any number of algorithms, and mathematically we can figure anything out. The idea being that if we can use reason and logic, put together the right formulas, we can understand anything and everything. Naturally, this left brain approach to everything will be challenged, and it'll be challenged by folks in the Enlightenment that follows. So let's go there next. This Age of Enlightenment is really important for several different reasons. And first and foremost, I'm going to announce a little bit of bias here. That yes, I tend to be much more of a military and diplomatic historian, that's true. But I'm also an intellectual historian, meaning I study the history of ideas. What was it that Franklin was thinking? What was it that Jefferson and Madison were thinking? Now, I can't know what they were thinking. I can read their letters and get an idea. I can also read their letters and diaries and understand who they studied. What books were they reading? Who was writing those books? And some of the individuals you're looking at on this slide, those were the individuals they were reading. Therefore, this 18th century or 1700s that is the Enlightenment is enormously impactful on global history, largely because the individuals that posited ideas here about how society should work, how people should act and or behave, how they should treat one another, how they should interact with their environment, all of those ideas were then taken during the 19th century and 20th century and applied by theorists as well, and we're living some of those laws today. Therefore, for me, this Age of Enlightenment is hugely important if you want to understand the modern mind and modern society. As an example of that, let's start with John Locke. John Locke was in some ways writing in opposition to and building on the work of René Descartes. Now, you can freely Google any number of his important works, and there are lots of them. But perhaps the most important, or at least most well known, is his essay concerning human understanding. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke posits this notion that all individuals, as they come out the birth canal, were all born free, equal, and independent. We just are. We have this clean slate, tabula rasa. Whatever's happened in the past doesn't matter. Whatever happens in the future will matter because that will imprint on us and in many ways shape our own worldview, shape how we act, shape how we behave, so on and so forth. But we all come out the birth canal free, equal, and independent. So if we have kings and queens in society, how does that happen? They must be man-made. And if they are man-made, they can be unmade by man as well. You can see where this language, where these thoughts can be dangerous if you're kings and queens. As an interesting sort of sidebar, for those of you that may have been hooked on that old television series, I think it was an ABC series, Lost, L-O-S-T, you will recall that one of the central characters in that story, his name was John Locke. And John Locke was in a wheelchair before the plane crashed on the island. And then he wasn't in a wheelchair. Tabula rasa, clean slate, we start anew. Don't think that that was a mere coincidence of the writers, because in fact they will use several other individuals associated with the Enlightenment, Jeremy Bentham and others. So an interesting sort of sidebar perhaps. And by the way, for those of you that haven't seen the series, you might want to go ahead and binge watch that at some point. Before moving on from John Locke and talking about a few others on this slide, I'd be entirely remiss if I failed to mention that he happens to be one of the 3 greatest minds the world has ever produced, according to Thomas Jefferson. And in fact, John Locke would posit in his writings that all individuals are endowed with certain rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property. And understand that in Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he uses those exact words and that exact phrase. If there was a Turnitin in Jefferson's age, he'd have a 100% match to John Locke. America's founding thought is based on these individuals in the Enlightenment era. Let's pick up with another one next. The Baron de Montesquieu, depicted here on the left side of this slide, wrote a very influential work in the mid-1700s titled The Spirit of the Laws. And in The Spirit of the Laws, he posits this notion of a separation of powers. Most of these individuals were historians of their own right, and they understood that all civilizations at some point will decline. They will go away. And most of them go away because of this centralization of power. Therefore, if you want to play for time, if you want to extend the life of an empire, you have to separate power. Thus, when America's founding generation starts to talk about setting up a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, they're reading Montesquieu's work, checks and balances, limiting the power of any one entity or branch so that the centralization of power can't happen as quickly and a civilization can last Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the upper right-hand corner will write a work entitled The Social Contract. And in the social contract, he comes up with this compact theory. And within this compact theory, he's talking about ways societies can flourish. Now, yes, he's writing in opposition to Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan and this idea of a state of nature, that we are always in a state of nature. There's kill or be killed. Therefore, you have to have a strong central king to maintain order. That's the view of Hobbes, and that fits if you're kings and queens. That's a nice message. But if you're Jean-Jacques Rousseau and you want to call BS on that, you want to build off the work of John Locke and say, yeah, you know, he might be right there, that if we all are free, equal, and independent, then we ought to be able to have independency and liberty. But yet there are limits to liberties. I can't blow a stop sign and go through there 90 miles an hour without threatening the life and livelihood of someone else. Therefore, as a society, we come together and we compromise and we make laws. And law becomes the king or queen of society. And over time, if we find that laws are not working for us, we can do what? Amend them. Sound familiar? Yes. So when the John Adamses of the world push hard to make the law king of this new land, this new republic, this new world, this new America, we can thank in some sense Jean-Jacques Rousseau for that. What about the ladies? Enter Mary Wollstonecraft. In 1792, she writes a work titled A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And within the book, she's basically saying, yo, I love these boys from the Enlightenment age. I love you. The problem is, you're brilliant idiots. You're pushing for social change. You're pushing for social justice, different ways of thinking and interacting with one another. I love it. I love it. But the problem is, you're only leveraging 50% of society. Let ladies play. We have a mind too. And in fact, we have an important role to play in society because we generally raise the freaking kids. And if you want a virtuous society, if you want a society peopled by individuals with principles and ethics and social mores, that starts at home. And if it starts at home, it starts with mama. Therefore, mama had to have access to an education. Mama ought to be able to share that education with her children as well. And this ideology will travel across the Atlantic into Britain's American colonies and eventually those American states, what one historian refers to as the Republican motherhood, that while women were civilly emasculated, which means they didn't have the right to vote, they did play an exceedingly important role in society because they reared the children. And the founding generation firmly believed if you didn't have a virtuous, morally sound, centered society, the Republican experiment would fail. And as a result of that, it was up to mama to make sure that the children's had that moral compass and code. That's what would make this republic endure. Hugely important role. And Mary Wollstonecraft is very instrumental in that message. Not to Jones, Adam Smith, and Voltaire here, but we're going to bypass those two cats. I'd ask that you go ahead and research them a little bit. I want to focus in the time we have left here on the two gentlemen to the right of Mary Wollstonecraft, Denis Diderot and Immanuel Kant. Now, Denis Diderot might arguably be the most important of the Enlightenment philosophers, largely because he wasn't one. He was an editor. This guy helped edit this thing called an encyclopedia. For those of us that have a few moons behind us, we might remember accessing this thing called an Encyclopedia Britannica. That's how we got our information. For those with less moons behind you and more in front of you, you have Wikipedia. That's what Denis Diderot released and unleashed on European society. Individuals that didn't have access to higher education, they couldn't afford it, now they could get it. And as a result of this, it allowed individuals to unleash themselves, to create and innovate and rise. By now, you might be recognizing a pattern of perhaps revolutionary political thought and maybe a little romanticism. Both of those brought together equally well under the last person we'll talk about, named Immanuel Kant. Kant's critique of pure reason will begin to call into question pure reason, that zeros and ones can't explain everything. They can't explain abstractions. That maybe we need to use our heart as much as our head. That an X and an O can do as much as a 0 and a 1. And this is the message of the Enlightenment. That zeros and ones should support, not supplant, X's and O's. Therefore, the right and left brain must be used in balance. And thus, as we move out of part 3 into part 4, which will be the age of exploration, I want you to keep this in mind because Europeans are going to carry these ideas with them.